All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. To begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, to thank Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all of the shiurim and droshos this month in memory of their parents, to thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the shiurim and droshos this month in memory of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport, to thank Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe ben Avraham David. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Aaron, Sean, and Judah Elbaum, in the merit of a refuah shlema for Ami ben Chayo. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of those who have need a refuah will have one together with Kol Choli Yisrael. All of the neshamos will have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. And above with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Lamed Hey 35. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Lamed Dalid Amud Beis 34b, 10 lines up from the bottom. So remember, again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, because we were in the middle of a really fascinating discussion, which in Meretz Hashem we will continue and, God willing, conclude today, which is the concept of whether or not Shabbos is kova'as l'maiser. Meaning what? In a typical case, we understand that when does produce become subject to tithing obligations, to maiser? Ultimately, again, you really need two things. Number one, the completion of the process. Complete a process. Processing is done. The produce itself is fully finished. And what we call ri'iyas pnei habayis, or ri'iyas hachotzer, coming into the courtyard of the home or coming into the home itself. Those are the two processes you need in order to trigger a meiser obligation. What the Gemara was dealing with is the possibility that maybe anything you're going to eat on Shabbos, by definition, is also subject to the meiser obligation. Now, what's the logic of that? So the Gemara quoted the pasuk, the karasa la Shabbos oneg, that says anything you eat on Shabbos is part of the mitzvah of oneg, which means that Shabbos. Actually, let me add in one more piece. The other piece is even if, let's say, the food is not fully processed and the food has not yet seen the entranceway of the home, even then you're only allowed to eat achilas arai, a snack. You're not allowed to eat achilas keva, a meal from untithed produce. The havamina that the Gemara was operating with is that maybe anything you eat on Shabbos has the status of what? The status of keva. Status of keva, and therefore by definition, even if it's not fully processed, or even if it hasn't yet seen the home, halacha l'maisa, it should be subject to the laws of, to the obligation of meiser. So that's the theme we're continuing on today, and in Meretz Hashem, we'll see the halacha l'maisa as well on that. So Rav Nachman. So Marzuch said name Rav Nachman. Af anan nami tanina. We also learned as follows: Va'od Amar Rabbi Eliezer Omeid Adam ala muktzeh erev shviyos. We'll say this is our Mishnah, right? What did the Mishnah say? A person could stand by his produce on erev Shabbos during a Shemitah year. And remember again, Rabbi Eliezer said, what could he say? Mikan ani ochal lamachar. I'm eating from here. I'm eating from here tomorrow, right? So the Gemara says, Taima, the Shiyas, the Labarisur. Now the only reason this works is why? Because it's a Shemitah year. Because we'll say, what happens on a Shemitah year? What are you exempt from on a Shemitah year? Meiser, right? There's no Meiser obligation on a Shemitah year. So therefore, again, Rabbi Eliezer is setting up a very specific case where a person is standing by produce that is currently drying out, right? It's being dried. And a person wants to go, and remember, that means ben hashmashos, it may be inedible. Now remember again, Hilchos Muktzah says that what? If something is unusable ben hashmashos, then what? Then what? It remains unusable for the duration of Shabbos. So what the person is doing is proactively setting aside something for use. Mikan ani ochel machar. From here I'm going to eat tomorrow. Now, the only reason that works is because he doesn't have a problem. The only issue he has to contend with is what? The only issue he has to contend with is muktzah. What doesn't he have to contend with? Meiser, because it's Shemitah. So which sounds like it's only because it's a Shemitah year that he doesn't have to worry about Meiser. But if it wasn't the Shemitah year, this setup would not work, because on Shabbos he could not eat without removing Meiser, because Shabbos is Koveya. Shabbos establishes a Meiser obligation, but you can't tithe on Shabbos. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, but you see again, for the rest of the, right, if it wasn't a Shemitah year, this would be problematic. What do you see? The Gemara says, my taima, lav mishum de Shabbos kava. So we'll say this seems to be a proof to the fact, to the statement that Shabbos itself triggers a meiser obligation, right? That even if produce is not fully processed, and even if there has not yet been a re'iyas pnei habayis, of bringing it into the home, bekarasa l'Shabbos oneg, every act of consumption on Shabbos is considered to be achilas keva, a meal, and therefore Shabbos by definition triggers a meiser obligation. To which the Gemara says, so and we're just trying to prove that from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer sets up his case where I'm designated fruit that is currently drying for consumption on Shabbos, and the Mishnah Dafka sets it up as a case of Erev Shabbos during Shemitah. Why do you have to bring Shemitah into this? Oh, because Shemitah tells you there's no chiyuv of meiser, which tells you that had there been a chiyuv of meiser, this setup that Rabbi Eliezer is proposing would not have worked. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Lo, Shaindy Hasam Kelman Family Mikanani Ochalamachar Kava Leiluye. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Maybe the issue over here is as follows. Even if this wasn't a Shemitah year, the truth is, here's the issue. What is the guy saying on Erev Shabbos, right? He's saying, Mikan ani ochel. Now, we saw machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about how specific do you have to be in your designation. Okay, so believing that machlokes aside, a person is actively saying, I'm going to eat this tomorrow. I'm going to eat this tomorrow. The Gemara suggests, Rabbi Eliezer suggests, that maybe kava le'iluye. That act of actively designating food that you are going to eat tomorrow on Shabbos, by definition, triggers a meiser obligation. In other words, but I want to be clear, nothing to do with Shabbos. It has to do with the fact that the moment you go ahead and you say, Mikan ani ochel, ultimately, again, that triggers a meiser obligation. The Gemara says, "Ihachi might your Shabbos." I feel b'chol nami. So if that's the case, okay, even if I want to accept that assertion, so then why set up the case as a guy who's standing on Erev Shabbos and making that declaration? If indeed you are correct that any time a person goes ahead and says "Mikan ani ochel," that creates a keva situation, triggers a meiser obligation. Why set it up as Erev Shabbos? To which the Gemara says, "You're right. You're right." Hakamash malon the teval muchan who ate al Shabbos shim avar v'tikno metukan. Because we'll say actually the Mishnah is going to teach me another halacha, which is that technically speaking, I will say in general, there's an interesting discussion in halakha. If you do something that you're not supposed to do, right? I avid mahani, I avid lo mahani. If you do something illegal, do the repercussions of your illegal act create a new legal reality or not? Right? That's in general. We find that machlokes many times in halacha. Here's a perfect example. You're not supposed to take tithes on Shabbos. You're not supposed to take meiser. What if you did? What if you did? Is the produce considered to be tithed? To which the Gemara says yes. To which the Gemara says the reason why the Mishnah is setting this up as a case of where you're setting aside something on Erev Shabbos is to teach you that tevel, untithed produce, is considered to be muchan on Shabbos, prepared for you. So it's meaning muchan, that if you were to violate the law and to tithe the produce, the effects of your illegal act would be legally binding. Right? Amazing. So therefore, again, the Gemara says that's why it's illustrating the halakha. So we'll say, so what we have over here, before we go on to Lamed Heb and Aleph, what we have over here so far is the Gemara telling me like this. The Gemara toying with the idea that Shabbos is koveya. Shabbos establishes a meiser obligation for any food you're going to eat on Shabbos, even if that food is what? Number one, not fully processed, and even if there has not yet been a re'iyas pnei habayis, right, to bring it into the home. The Gemara wanted to prove that assertion from the Mishnah. All the Gemara just did is say, not sure you could do that from the Mishnah, right, because the Mishnah The Mishkas and the Gemara wanted the way the Gemara wanted to prove it from the Mishnah was because the Mishnah Dafka sets this up as an Erev Shabbos case during Shemitah, where there is no obligation of Meiser during the Shemitah year. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. The only reason the Gemara set it up by Shemitah was to teach you a different halacha, that Tevel is Muchan Hu Lagabe Shabbos. What does that mean? That although you're not supposed to tithe Tevel on Shabbos, if you did it, technically it works. Top of Lamed Hey. V'halo Mosro Choser. But there's a different issue over here, which is about to say, in general, the leftovers can be returned. Now, what does that mean? V'sham inon le the Rabbi Eliezer da'amar kol hecha de Mosro Choser lo kava. Rabbi Eliezer has a general rule that whenever you take food and the leftovers of that food can be returned, that ultimately your act of consumption is not called keva, is not called achilas keva. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. We're going to illustrate this with a case in just a moment. But look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Heichi matzis lemimar dekviusa mishum deborehu v'halocha v'halo afilu nita harbe minatev al b'chol v'nosein lefanav demechse dekvi alei b'achi lemaruba." So let me tell you this outside. So the idea is as follows. This is fascinating. If you take food, you have a large pile of food. You take some of the food out, but you take it in a way that whatever you don't eat can be returned to the pile, or could be returned to the we'll use the word pile, then by definition that act of consumption is not called achilas keva. It's actually quite fascinating. In other words, achilas keva, the halacha suggesting means you're taking, and whatever you take you're going to eat, and whatever you don't eat, what happens to it? Right? Whatever, it gets thrown out. Anytime you could take and return back, ultimately again that's called a snack. That's called achilas harai. So let me illustrate this with an example. The Gemara says, "Disnan hanotel zeisim min hama'atan." If a person takes olives from a vat, tovel achas b'melach va'ochal. So what can you do? You could dip them into salt one at a time, and you could eat them, and that's called achilas harai. That's called a snack, and you could eat it even if the olives had not been tithed. Vim tavel v'nasan lefanav asara chayiv. But if you took out 10 olives and you dip them all in salt at once, right? And there are 10 olives are sitting in front of you. Rabbi said, then what? Chayiv v'maiser. Why chayiv v'maiser? Why? Because apparently 10 olives are considered to be what? Right? Keva, a meal. And not only that, you can't what? You can't return it back to the vat. Why not? It's been salted. Good. So that's the rule. That's another rule in Hilchos Maiser, which is that halacha l'maisa, anything that is taken and can be returned, by definition is called achilas harai. Another example of this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, min ha'ma'atan tahar chayiv, min ha'ma'atan tamei pater. Rabbi Eliezer says, if you took it from a vat which only houses tahar olives, then whatever you take from the vat, ultimately again, you're chayav in meiser. But if you took it from a vat which was tamei, right, the olives are tameim, then ultimately again, you're pater from meiser. Why? Mipnei shu machzir es hamosar. Because you have the ability to return the leftovers. V'havinon ba. But we asked about this. I don't understand what that means. Maishna reishu, maishna zeva. What do you mean if the olive, if the vat is tamei, the vat is tar? What does that mean? Here we go. Reisha b'ma'atan tahar v'gavra tamei. The first case is talking about a case where the ma'atan, the vat, is tahar, but the person is tamei. So we'll say, what happens if you're tamei and you take olives from a tahar vat? Can you return the remainder of the olives? No, because now they're tameim. You can't return the leftovers. Seifa, the second case is b'ma'atan tamei v'gavra tamei. But if the olives are tamei and the person is tamei, then what? You could go ahead and return the olives. Therefore, I will say, again, we're just trying to highlight a principle. And it happens to be, these are all fascinating principles in Hilchos Meiser, which I will say this idea that by definition, if you could take food from a larger collective group and eat what you want and return the rest, by definition, that's called harai. That's called harai. Now, what's interesting about that is, it even sounds like that's called harai, even if what? Or independent of how much you consume or how much you're returning, which is just interesting. In any event, so therefore we'll say, why does this matter to us? So the Gemara says, isn't this the case of our Mishnah? But say, remember again, what's the case of our Mishnah? What type of food are we talking about? We're talking fruit that's drying out on the roof or fruit that's drying out somewhere, right? So this sounds like a case where I could take and return, right? Because remember, again, bepashtos, we would assume that when you're drying out fruit, you take what you want, and let's say you're drying figs, and you took off 5 figs, and you only ate 3 of them. Bepashtos, you could go ahead and return it back. If you could return it back, by definition, that says it's achilas arai. If it's achilas arai, then what? There's no meiser obligation. If there's no meiser obligation, you can't infer anything from the Mishnah about the power of Shabbos to trigger a meiser obligation. Because the truth is, even though we're setting it up as a case of Erev Shabbos, it's not really the biggest deal that it's Shabbos, because it's achilas arai anyway, and you could return it. To which the Gemara says, Masnisin nami b'muktset tahar v'gavra tameh. No, our Mishnah is talking about a case, we'll say, of where essentially the produce is tahar, but the individual is tameh. And therefore I will say, if the produce is tahar and the individual is tameh, then what? You can't return the leftovers. Ultimately, again, you can't return the produce. So therefore, again, don't bring up this topic, because this topic is inconsequential for our particular case. V'alo muchzarin va'omdinheim. To which the Gemara says, but aren't they, look at Rashi, Parchina v'alo muchzarin va'omdin, v'halo lo notlan ella debar ba'amahu, v'chevan dechi notlan v'efsher b'chazara mahanyu lechazara, v'lo mikva kilo efsher b'chazara nami, v'lo notlan ella dibura ba'alma, ve'ein lecha chazara. Because we'll say, so ultimately, again, to which the Gemara says, remember, this is a different kind of case. In this case, Rabbi said, Erev Shabbos, are you taking anything? No, all you're doing is dibura ba'almahu, right? It's just simple speech. It's a verbal designation. So this, the truth is, should be even a stronger case, because in the case where you're taking and returning, okay, you're actually taking. This case, it's only dibur. Ella, rather, Rabbi say, the Gemara says as follows. Rather, the Gemara says, Ella, I've seen about Ashi, Rabbi Eliezer ka'amrit, Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei. Rabbi Eliezer has a different svara. Da'amar truma kava v'kol shekin Shabbos. So we'll say this is very interesting. Rabbi Eliezer has a different approach. Rabbi Eliezer says the taking of truma goes ahead and establishes an obligation, and all the more so Shabbos. I will say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's Rashi in the intermediate wide lines. First of them, Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei damar truma kavas. Davar shelo nigmar malachto shemik bir trumaso ne'asar la'achila sarai achi after shamas. Well, it's very interesting. It says like this: if you separated out truma from produce that wasn't fully processed, halach l'maiser, the removal of truma by definition triggers the obligation for meiser. Okay, now the truth is we're not going to get into that discussion right now. We're more interested in the second part, which is Rabbi Eliezer is on record as saying that what? That halacha l'maisa, Shabbos is also kovea. Truma. So if you separate out truma creates a meiser obligation, v'kol shekein Shabbos, and all the more so Shabbos. Now we'll say, now what's the logic of that? That if taking truma triggers a meiser obligation, certainly Shabbos, the mere Shabbos itself triggers a meiser obligation from anything you're going to eat. So Rashi says, v'kol shekein Shabbos, techashiva achilasa. So I will say, because ultimately this goes back to what we said before. Because on Shabbos, every act of consumption is considered to be achilas keva. There is no arai, there is no snacking on Shabbos. Everything is considered to be achilas keva. Where do we know? So in this now, here we go. Perus shetarman achal nigmar malachton. If you have fruit from which truma was removed before the fruit was fully processed, Rabbi Eliezer oser le'echol mehen arai. Rabbi Eliezer says you can no longer snack from these. In other words, we must remember again, normally, before you separate out meiser, you're allowed to eat achilas arai. Rabbi Eliezer says if you separated out truma already, you can no longer eat achilas arai. V'cham matir, v'cham say that it's mutter. V'cham say that it's mutter. So we'll say what the Gemara wants to suggest is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, if Rabbi Eliezer holds that truma triggers a meiser obligation, right? If you remove truma from unprocessed produce, that triggers a meiser obligation. Then all the more so Shabbos, when you eat from unprocessed produce on Shabbos, that will trigger a meiser obligation. The Gemara says, Tashma miseifa, but look at the seifa. V'chachamim omrim ad she'yir shom v'yormi kan v'ad kan. The Chamsi Barabbas back in our Mishnah. The Chachamim say that Allah Lamaisa, they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. And whereas Rabbi Eliezer allows you to say, Mikan ani ochel, from here I will eat. And he makes that general statement. The Chachamim say you have to actively demarcate where you're going to eat from. Taima the Erev Shabbos b'Shvius. The only reason that he has to do this is because the only reason this works is because this is an Erev Shabbos during the Shemitah year, and during the Shemitah year, Meiser obligations don't apply. The Gemara says, Dala bari surihu, ha b'shar shanei shavua, but if you would do this in any other year, tibnei isurininu, where you would have to take Meiser, asurim, ultimately it wouldn't work. Why? My taima, lav mishum de Shabbos kava. The reason it wouldn't work during a non-Shemitah year is because, again, you would have to take Meiser from this produce before consuming it on Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, Lo, Shaindy Hasam, Kevan Damar Mikan Va'ad Kan Ani Ochel Amachar, Kavale. No, it could be different. I will say, even if you hold that Shabbos doesn't generate a Meiser obligation, when you make a declarative statement that says, from here until here I am going to eat, that makes your active consumption into an achilas keva, and therefore triggers the Meiser obligation. Ihachi, if that's the case, my area Shabbos afilu b'chol nami. So if that's the case, according to Chachamim, then why set up this case as a case of Erev Shabbos during the Shemitah year? Set it up as a weekday, right? Set it up as a weekday. To which the Gemara says, you're right. As we said before, hakamash malon the teval muchan hu eitzel Shabbos. Shim avar v'tikno mitukon. Because the Gemara is teaching me another secondary halacha, which is that tevel is considered to be ready for consumption on Shabbos, and even though it is illegal to go ahead and separate out Meiser, if you did so, your illegal act would create positive legal consequences. Namely, again, that the produce would be mu'usr, would be tithed, or minhi, so raise a kasha. So I'll say, so again, we're still stuck in the same place, which is, what is the impact that Shabbos consumption has on untithed produce? Does Shabbos render every act of consumption into an achilas keva? In which case, even if the produce is not fully processed, and even if there has not been a re'iyas penei abayis, you can't eat from it because Shabbos itself triggers a Meiser obligation or not? That's still the $1 million question we're trying to answer. We have not yet successfully answered it. So the Gemara goes weiter, another case. Or minhi, haya ochal be'eshkal v'nichnas migina lechatzer. Rabbi say, interesting case. If you're eating a cluster of grapes, the Rabbi say, what's the status of grapes in terms of hilchos maisrus? So if you look in the wide lines of Rashi, 3 lines down, there's very interesting. Haya ochal be'eshkal, ustam eshkal lav gimar melachahi, Distam anovim ledricha kaimi. Rabbi say this is fascinating. In the Gemara's view, a cluster of grapes is an unfinished product because the majority of grapes are used for wine. Again, this obviously is a societal designation as well, because again, I think we look at a cluster of grapes as a finished product. But from the Gemara's perspective, the majority use of grapes was to create wine, and therefore a cluster of grapes in halacha is looked at as unfinished produce. Okay, so now watch this. You're eating a cluster of grapes. V'nichnas migina lechatzer, and you walk in from your garden, from your field, into your chatzer. They're both saying, now remember again, Now, why is that halachically significant? Why is that halachically significant? Because remember again, the chatzar is what? Chatzar is one of the areas that triggers a meiser obligation, right? Either bringing it into your home, bringing it into your chatzar. So now I'm walking, eating unfinished produce, eating a cluster of grapes. I walk in from the gina, from my garden, into the chatzar. The shaila now, of course, is what's my meiser liability, if any? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar. So we're going to define what this means. But Bepashtos, Rabbi Eliezer says, finish up. Rashi says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar, in Ratza Ligmar Bechatzah Yigmar Chila. So the Ein Chatzar Kovan, Stav Shalim Malachtos. We'll say what it sounds like is happening. Rabbi Eliezer says, it's fine. You could continue to eat your grapes. Why? Because bringing unfinished produce into a chatzar does not trigger a meiser obligation. The only thing that triggers a meiser obligation is what? Bringing finished produce into your chatzar. But unfinished produce in your chatzar, keep on eating. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo Yigmar. Rabbi Yoshua says you may not continue to eat. Okay, so it sounds like what Rabbi Yoshua is saying is even bringing unfinished produce into the chutzner triggers the meiser obligation. Okay, that's part one. Part two, chashcha b'leilei Shabbos. What happens if again you're eating these grapes on erev Shabbos? You bring them into your chutzner, and now it's Shabbos night. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar. Rabbi Eliezer says you could still finish the grapes. Rabbi Yoshua Omer Lo Yigmar. And Rabbi Yoshua says you cannot finish the grapes. So I will say, so bepashtos, look at Rashi just a moment. So hachigar sin chashcha leili Shabbos yigmar. In Ratzah ligmar ki hechi darn bechatzar amar b'Shabbos yigmar chos de'im Shabbos kovas davar shlo yigmar malatis. So I will say, sounds like over here that what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is the same way that your chatzar does not trigger a meiser obligation for what? For non-fully processed produce, Shabbos also doesn't trigger a meiser obligation. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says, at Shabbos, finish the cluster. Rabbi Yeshua says, the same way that your chatzar triggers a meiser obligation, even for unfinished processed produce, so too does Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, so that's a pretty explicit, this is pretty explicit. Rabbi Eliezer holds that Shabbos is not koveya. To which the Gemara says, Hasam kidiktani taima, Rabbi Nasan Omer, Lo kish Rabbi Eliezer yigmar b'chatzar, yigmar, rather, Ela yotzi chutz l'chatzar v'yigmar. So we'll say, this is incredible. When Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm sorry. Taimid Rabbi Nasan Omer. Taimid Rabbi Nasan really meant like this. Lo kisham Rabbi Elazar yigmar b'chatzar. I disagree with Rabbi Elazar who holds that you can finish it in the chatzar. Ela yotzi chutz l'chatzar v'yigmar. Rather, take it out of the chatzar and finish it in the gina. V'lo kisham Rabbi Elazar yigmar b'Shabbos yigmar. Ela mamtin m'motzei Shabbos v'yigmar. To which the Gemara says, no. What it means ultimately is that one opinion is saying take it out to the chatzar, finish it in the chatzar. I'm not finish it in the gina, not in the chatzar. And when we say ultimately yigmar, it means don't finish it on Shabbos, rather finish it on Motzei Shabbos. Ki Rabbi Yochanan, here we go. Echad Shabbos, ve'echad Truma, ve'echad chatzar, ve'echad mekach, kulon ein kovin ela b'davar shenigmara malachtan b'Shabbos. When Ravin came along, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan as follows. He said, whether it's Shabbos, the removal of Truma, bringing it into a chatzar, using it for commercial purposes, none of these things create a meiser obligation unless, of course, what? Unless, of course, the produce is fully processed. So I will say, it sounds like over here the Gemara is reaching a conclusion that halacha l'maisa, as powerful as Shabbos is, and as transformative as Shabbos is when it comes to consumption, when it comes to achila, even Shabbos cannot trigger a meiser obligation unless the produce has been fully processed. Now hold on to this. We're going to go through all of these cases and then we'll see the Rambam. Lafuke mideh Hillel. And this comes to exclude the position of Hillel. Because what did Hillel say? Disanya hama amer perosi makom l'makom liktzar. The key to Shem. If a person piled fruit from one place to another place in order to allow the fruit to dry out and it becomes Shabbos, Amar Yehuda Hillel li'atzmo oser. Hillel said that halacha l'maisa, the produce is aser. Right? When it says la'atzmo, I mean he was a das yochid, a singular opinion that the produce is not fit for consumption because Shabbos creates a meiser obligation and you can't tithe on Shabbos. Amud Beis, chatzar. What's the case of chatzar? Lafuki mid Rabbi Yaakov. That comes to exclude the case of. So let's remember again. Ravin is saying that Shabbos only establishes a meiser obligation if the produce is fully processed. That comes to exclude the position of Hillel, because Hillel holds that Shabbos could generate a meiser obligation even for non-fully processed food. Okay, next thing Ravin said is even when you bring your produce into the chatzar, a chatzar only generates a meiser obligation for what? Fully processed food. Lafugim Rabbi Yaakov, Disnan, Hamavir te'ina bechatzero liktzos. If a person spreads out his figs in his chatzar for to dry out, Panav ubnei Beitzah ochan lehen arai Uptur min meiser. His family members could snack from the figs, and it's pater from meiser, which again, because it's not fully processed. V'tani Allah, Rabbi Yaakov mechayiv, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda poter. And we learned about this. Rabbi Yaakov says, no, you're chayiv. We'll say, now, why does Rabbi Yaakov say you're chayiv? Because Rabbi Yaakov holds that once the produce is in the chutzner, even if what? Even if the produce is not fully processed, the mere bringing it into the chutzner generates the meiser obligation. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, right? Truma, when Rabin said that halacha l'maisa, that truma, that taking of truma, right? We have this case in the Gemara. If you took truma out of unfinished produce, that does not generate a meiser obligation. Lafukim Rabbi Eliezer, disnan peros shetarman achlo nigmar malachton. If you took truma from produce that wasn't fully processed, Rabbi Eliezer oser le'achol mehen arai. Rabbi Eliezer says you can no longer snack from that produce. The Chachamim matir, and the Chacham say that it's mutter. So Rav is coming to exclude the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Good. Mekach. What's the case of using unfinished produce for in a sale transaction, a commercial transaction? Here we go. Halokeach te'inem ama'aretz. If you purchase figs from an ama'aretz, so we'll say ama'aretz in this context means what? Someone who's not versed in the halachas of Trumas and Meisros. So what's the halacha? B'makom shurov b'nei adam darsin. In a place where the majority of people make cakes of pressed figs, ochel mehen arai, you can go and you could snack from these figs, uma'asron demai, but you have to tithe them again as demai. Remember again, demai means questionable produce from an ama'aretz. Shmamina tzlas, you learn from here three things. Number one, shmamina mekach eno kovas. Just because you purchase something doesn't automatically trigger a meiser obligation, unless, of course, the produce was fully processed. Ushmamina rov ame aretz ma'asrene. Interesting enough, I will say, you see from here that, in fact, interestingly enough, we assume that the majority of ame aretz do tithe. The gezerah of demai is only there to be careful with the minority who do not. The reason we know that is because the lashon over here is ma'asrin demai. We take meiser from the demai. It doesn't say ma'asrin es aperos, right? Ma'asrin es demai means we actually believe the majority of amei aretz do tithe, but the minority who don't cause us to have to retithe certain things. Ushmamina ma'asrin demai ma'amei aretz. Afilu b'davar shlo nigmara malachto. And you see from here also that we go ahead and we take meiser from demai of an ama aretz, even if it has not yet been fully processed. Lafukim yihad disnan, to exclude the following position. Hamachlif peros im chavero, if you exchange fruit with your friend, zeh lechol v'zeh lechol, and both parties, Reuven and Shimon, exchange fruit, and both of them are going to eat the fruit. Zeh liktos v'zeh liktos, or they're both going to dry out the fruit. Or zeh le'echol v'zeh liktos, or one is going to eat and one is going to dry out the produce. Chayiv, ultimately again, chayiv in meiser. Yehuda Omer, le'echol chayiv liktos pater. Yehuda says, no. The only time we ever generate a meiser obligation is when you're going to be engaged in an act of consumption of achila. But if you're just going to put it out to dry, there is no meiser obligation. So I both say, how do we paskin? Right? Because again, at the end of the day, let's emerge with a piece of halacha l'maiser over here. So I will say, this is in Hilchos Meiser, in the Rambam, Perek Gimel Halacha Gimel. Gimel Hilchos Meiser. And here we go, Boss. This is actually a good halacha to know. Ve'echad mishisha dvarim koveh l'maisros. Any of the following 6 things create an obligation to take meiser. Any of the following 6 things trigger a meiser obligation upon produce. Number 1, ve'eluhein. Here we go. Habayis, bringing produce into the home. Hamekach, going ahead and engaging in a transaction with produce. Ha'esh, cooking it. Melach, salting it. Truma, taking truma from the produce. And Shabbos. But, very important qualification, the kulan ein koven ella b'davar shenigmara melachto. So we'll see here having the Rambam paskins that halacha l'maisa, all of these 6 things. So working backwards, remember again, we were super focused on Shabbos. And what we wanted to know essentially was, could Shabbos go ahead and generate a meiser obligation on produce that was not fully processed? And the answer to that question is no. Shabbos is powerful in that Shabbos, we'll say, here's what happens with Shabbos. With Shabbos, halacha l'maisa, again, there's no achilas arai. So anything you eat has the status of keva. So even when during the week you'd be able to go ahead and snack on something without having to take meiser, Shabbos doesn't allow you to do that. But I will say, but halacha l'maisa, bringing meiser into the home is only triggers a meiser. Bringing produce into the home only triggers a meiser obligation if the produce is fully completed. Transaction, cooking, salting, truma. All of these things only trigger a meiser obligation if the fruit is, or if the produce is fully processed. Good, I will say, that is the halacha l'maisa. Hadron Allah Hamevi, Mazel Tov, brand new parak. Mashilin peros derech haruba b'yom. So it's an interesting case. Still with the drying, not shumas l'maisers now, but still with the drying out of the fruit. So the imagery is the same. You have spread fruit out to dry on your rooftop. So now what happens, I say? You want to go ahead and, we'll see, let's say it's about to rain. So you want to go ahead, you don't want the produce to get wet. So what do you want to do? You want to push the produce into your home. So you have a skylight. Remember, I said they're operating with a flat roof. So you have a flat roof with a skylight. My fruit is sitting on top of my roof. So the Mishnah says, Mashilin peros derech haruba. Halacha l'maisa, you could lower the produce through the skylight. Lower the produce through the skylight. B'yamtiv, avalo b'Shabbos. You can do this on Yom Tiv, but you cannot do this on Shabbos. Umechas peros bekelim me'adlav. Similarly, again, if you have produce that is sitting on the roof, and let's say there's water dripping, or this, actually I take that back, this doesn't even have to be in the roof, this could be in your home. The point over here is you have produce dripping, you have water dripping on the produce. You can go ahead and cover your peros with kalim, right? You can go ahead and cover your fruit with some type of kli in order to prevent it from getting ruined. I both say we're going to see what's the chiddush in that. Remember, again, I both say we have the opinion of Rabbi Nechemiah, which again in the Hilchos Muktzah world we often don't reference because we're more focused on Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Nechemiah holds that what a kli can only be moved for what purpose? For a specifically designated useful purpose. So, and any other usage will be tircha yisera. So the Mishnah teaches we don't pass in that way. And halacha l'maisa, you can move a kli to cover your produce so it doesn't get ruined by the dripping wine. V'chein kadei yain, the kadei shemen. Same thing with, did I say dripping wine? Right, dripping water, sorry. Right, v'chein kadei yain, the kadei shemen. So too, if you have jugs of wine or jugs of oil, and there's water dripping on it, and you want to protect them, you could place a kli on top of them. V'nostin kli tachas hadalaf b'Shabbos. So what else can you do? Let's say you have a leak in your roof. You can go ahead and place a kli underneath that roof. Now, I will say, remember again from Smichas Chaver, we learned that in Hilchos Muktzah. What's the issue involved there? Little Chazara. Good. I'm sorry. So it could be an act of stira. Good. It's mevatal kli mehechano. Right. Ultimately, again, you're negating the kli from being useful anymore. So whether that's stira, good. We're going to see. We'll see this. So Gemir Hashem. Okay. So we'll say that's the Mishnah. So Itmar Rav Yehuda Rav Nasan Chad Tani Mashilin v'Chad Tani Mashilin. So the first thing we're going to do, interestingly enough, is spend a little bit of time on linguistics, right? On the word choice. So remember again, the Mishnah said Mashilin Peros Derech Aruba, which means that you could lower fruit through the skylight on Yom Tiv. So the Gemara is just talking about the word use. So Chad Tani Mashilin. One version had the word mashilin. V'chad tani mashchilin. The Gemara says, Amar Zutra, man tani mashilin lo mishtabish, or man tani mashchilin lo mishtabish. Rabbi Zutra said, the truth is, either word works. We're going to see they both mean the same thing, which is to lower. Man tani mashilin lo mishtabish. So the one who says mashilin, that works. Why? Dichsiv, because he quotes over here the pasuk in Devarim. The pasuk says ki yishal zeisecha. So the way we translate that is that the tree will throw down its fruit. Ki yishal zeisecha. So we'll say, so therefore mashilin is borrowed from the biblical lashon, is borrowed from the yishal. Umandetani mashchilin lo mishtabish. The one who says mashchilin is also not mistaken. Why? What does mashchilin mean? So the Gemara says disnan hashachol v'hakasel. So we'll say the pasuk over here, or the Gemara over here, is talking about different mumen in an animal. And what's shachol? Shachol shenishmata yirecho. Shachol means the animal's hip was dislocated. So we'll say, so the imagery there is the hip came out of its socket and went down. See, so mashchin is also a lashon of falling down. Kasul she'acha meirekosav meirekosav kiva mechaberta. So kasul is just one of the hips is higher than the other. Fine. The point of say is that whether you want to use mashilin or mashchilin, both are correct. Amrav Nachar bar Yitzchak, man detani mashirin lo mishtabish. Uman, the Gemara says, Uman detani mashchirin lo mishtabish. Uman detari manshirin lo mishtabish. So it comes along Rav Nachman and says, by the way, whether you use mashirin, mashchirin, or menashrin, all of those words are correct as well. They all mean falling down. Man ditani mashirin lo mishtabish disnan. So if you use mashirin, it's not incorrect. Why? Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Nazir lo yachof rosha ba'adama. A Nazir cannot wash his head with earth. Right? In other words, I guess use earth as a type of shampoo. Why? Because it'll cause hair to come out. So you see, mashir, Abosai means what? Something to fall out, right? Fall out and fall down. And the one who says mashchirin is also not mistaken. Disnan, hashachar v'hazug shalasaparim. Abosai shachar is a razor. Zug are scissors. Afa pisha nechluku tmeim. What is by hilchos tumas kelim? Even if the parts of the kli became detached, from one another, they still have the ability to go out and become tamei. So we'll say we don't care about we care about tumah, but for our purposes right now, the point over here is that a razor is called the shachar. Now, what does a razor do? Right? It removes hair, and the hair falls down. That's the idea. So that's why if you have lashon of mashchirin, it works as well. Uman detani minashrin or minashrin lo mishtabish tisnan misha nashru kelav b'mayim mahalik bahen ve'eno choshesh. So we'll say an interesting case, right? If somebody's clothing became soaked with water, we had this in Malabin, as we learned, somebody's kelim becomes soaked with water. Ultimately, again, mahalik bahem. You could walk in them. You could continue to walk in them. Ve'eno choshesh. We'll say Rashi says over here, mehalech bahen ve'misnagvin v'holchin ve'eno choshesh she'achshedu shekabsan. So we'll say, remember again, we had this case in a little bit of chazar smichas chaver. So you could go ahead and you could wear it. And what the Gemara actually is, it's highlighting over here something very interesting, which is we're not concerned about marasayin. In other words, if someone sees me wearing a wet garment, let's say I got stuck in the rain and now it's sun's out, someone's going to see me wearing a wet garment. The Gemara says, what could they suspect? That I laundered the garment. The Gemara says that we're not choshesh. We're not choshesh. Ultimately, again, that halacha lamaisa, we're not choshesh that somebody will think that I laundered the garment. Good. So we saw, by the way, in Smichas Chaver, we saw that there's an additional issue of wearing wet clothing, which could be an issue of what? Of schita, right? Of schita. But again, normally that we're not sorry about schita because it's real for a variety of different reasons. I mean, the Gemara says as follows. So the point of what I will say is that now the lashon of menashe means the rain ultimately comes in, right? The rain comes in, and then the rain also comes out of the garment. There is no concern. So you see again, the lashon of menashrin is also a proper lashon. Inami mihadisnan ezehu leket. What's leket? Hanosher b'shas katsira. It is grain that falls out of my hand during the time of harvest. So we'll say, so the point is you have a whole bunch of different, so the point the Gemara is making us aware of is that there are many different versions of this Mishnah that use different opening words to highlight the same dynamic, and it's absolutely fine. Beautiful. So Tnan, we'll say let's go a little bit weiter. So Tnan, mashilin peros derech aruba, you can go ahead and lower the produce through the skylight on Yom Tiv. Ad kama. I will say, here's an interesting shaila. The interesting shaila is, how much produce do you have the ability to go ahead and lower? In other words, I will say, the Mishnah just says you could lower produce through the skylight. So the shaila ultimately is there a cap? Right? Is there a certain amount you're allowed to go ahead and lower, and no more than that? So we'll say, listen to this. So ad kamo. So the Gemara says, We'll have another example of this. Mifanin arba v'chamesh kupo shel teven v'shel tavua mipnei archim ne'im bittel beis hamedrash. So we'll say, let's say the following situation: you're having company over, or for that matter, again, you're giving a shiur, you want to learn in the beis medrash, but there are baskets of hay, of straw. So what's talacha? You're allowed to move up to 4 or 5 baskets of straw in order to make room for your guests, or in order to go ahead and make room in the beis medrash. So that's giving us a shiur, that's giving us an amount for the amount of straw that one is permitted to go ahead and move on Yom Tiv. So b'pashtos, maybe we should say it's also 4 or 5 baskets worth. That's the amount you can move. V'dilma shani hasam. Well, no, maybe that case is different. Why? Di'ika bittel beis hamedrash. Because they will say there's a real need. In other words, I need the space. I need the space for my guests, or I need the space for people to learn the beis medrash. Aval hacha deleka bittel beis hamedrash lo. But in this case over here, where I don't need the space, maybe again I'm capped at a much smaller amount. Inami hasam hainu time medarim v'chamesh kupo shari mishum Shabbos dechamira v'lo asi lezazulei bei. Furthermore, again, maybe in the case of the 4 or 5 baskets of straw, that's permitted. That was a case of Shabbos. And by Shabbos in general, we're not worried that if we allow you to do something, you're going to come then to take shortcuts with the rest of Shabbos as well. Because Shabbos in general is considered to be very chamer. However, aval Yom Tiv dikil v'asi lezazulei bei klal lo. But maybe on Yom Tiv, where we're concerned, since Yom Tov already has certain kulas, we're concerned that if we allow you to move so much produce, you're going to come to take other liberties with Yom Tov, then maybe we should cap you at a much, much smaller amount. Inami le'idach gisa, or maybe there's another possibility. What's the other possibility? Hasam hainu taima deleka hefsid mammon. Say by Yom Tov, by the case of Shabbos. So remember again, just to point out what's happening over here. We have 2 cases. Our Mishnah says you could lower produce through the skylight in the window. What doesn't the Mishnah say? What doesn't the Mishnah say? How much produce? I'm comparing that now to another case in Shabbos. The case in Shabbos says if I have baskets of straw and I left baskets of straw in my dining room, I could go ahead and move it in order to accommodate guests. Or I left baskets of straw in the beis medrash, I can move it in order to go ahead and make room in the beis medrash. I can make room in the beis medrash. So we'll say, if you take a look at Rashi just a moment, by the way, Rashi says over here, actually no, don't worry. So now the shaila is, should I take the amounts by Shabbos and apply them to Yom Tiv? To which the Gemara kind of equivocates and goes back and forth and makes arguments in both ways. The last part the Gemara says is as follows. Inami le'idach gisa. Hasam hainu taima deleka hefsid mammon. Maybe I could say the reverse argument. So the Gemara just wanted to say, well, maybe you could only move 4 or 5 baskets by Shabbos because in general people are more vigilant by Shabbos than they are by Yom Tiv. But if you allow people to move that volume of produce, 4 or 5 baskets amount, by Yom Tiv, oh boy, what they're going to do, how they're going to trample on the sanctity of Yom Tiv. Now the Gemara goes in and makes a reverse argument. Inami lidachis. I can argue the opposite way. Hasam hainu taima deleka hefsid mammon. In the Shabbos case, there's no financial loss, right? In the Shabbos case, why am I moving the straw? Why? I need the space. It's a space issue, right? But there's no financial loss. Aval hacha diika hefsid mammon afilu tuvanami. We'll say now the Gemara makes the counter argument that maybe over here by Yom Tiv, remember, why am I moving produce? Or both say the Gemara doesn't say it explicitly, but I understand contextually why am I moving produce? Why? Because it's about to rain, right? I'm moving produce because at the end of the day, I am concerned that halacha lemaisa, it's going to rain and stuff is going to get ruined. The Gemara suggests maybe because the case of Yom Tov has an element of financial loss, maybe I should even be able to move more produce. In other words, Shabbos is a case where I need the space. Space, you're limited to 4 or 5 baskets of straw. Yom Tov, where there's financial loss, maybe I should be able to move more produce in that. We'll stop over here for today. I'm leaving you with this question. We'll pick up a Mir session tomorrow with the continuation of the discussion. How much produce are you allowed to move through the skylight on Yom Tiv? Shkoyach. I will say tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. We begin at 5:45 in Mir session tomorrow and Thursday. I'll send it out on the chat as well. Thank you.